Your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, a place where you feel safe. But when you notice small changes, lights turned on that you left off, food missing from the fridge, you realize someone else is there. The worst part? They're not breaking in. They've been hiding inside, watching you the entire time. Chapter 1. The Daniel LaPlante Incident. In 1986, the town of Townsend, Massachusetts, was shaken by a chilling incident involving a 16-year-old named Daniel LaPlante, whose actions would terrorize an unsuspecting family and leave the community in fear. LaPlante's story is not one of a typical break-in. His intrusion was far more sinister and unsettling, involving psychological torment and a disturbing invasion of privacy that the victims would never forget. What began as seemingly paranormal occurrences within the family's home quickly escalated into a real-life nightmare that would only end in horror. Daniel LaPlante's unsettling relationship with the Andrews family began under seemingly normal circumstances. Annie Andrews and her younger sister Jessica had recently lost their mother to cancer, leaving them vulnerable and grieving. The sisters were struggling to cope with the loss, and it was during this time that LaPlante first entered their lives. That LaPlante had originally contacted Annie under the guise of a mutual friend, pretending to be a boy named Danny. He portrayed himself as a charming, friendly teenager interested in getting to know her. The two spoke several times on the phone, and Annie was eventually convinced to go on a date with him. But when they met in person, Annie quickly realized that LaPlante had been lying about who he was. He was not the handsome, athletic boy he had described, but a disheveled and creepy teenager. Annie ended the date quickly, feeling unsettled by his appearance and demeanor. Humiliated by the rejection, LaPlante began to harbor an unhealthy obsession with Annie and her family, and he started planning his disturbing revenge. Shortly after the failed date, the Andrews sisters began to experience strange and unexplained phenomena in their home. Objects would mysteriously disappear and reappear in different places. Doors would open and close on their own, and there were persistent knocking sounds coming from the walls. Already on edge due to the loss of their mother, Annie and Jessica were convinced that these eerie occurrences were signs that their mother's spirit was trying to communicate with them, in a desperate attempt to connect with their deceased mother. The sisters conducted a seance in the house, hoping to speak with her spirit. But instead of comfort, the seance seemed to unleash even more terrifying events. The knocking sounds grew louder, and the activity in the house intensified. One night, Annie and Jessica discovered messages written on the walls in what appeared to be blood. Phrases like, "I'm in your room, come and find me, and I'm back, find me if you can," were scrawled across the walls, sending the girls into hysterics. Panicked and believing their home was haunted, the sisters ran to their neighbor's house and called their father, Brian Andrews. When Brian returned home, he searched the house thoroughly, but found no signs of an intruder. He dismissed the girls' fears as nothing more than grief and overactive imaginations, attributing the strange events to their emotional state. But the terror was far from over. One evening, when Brian was away and the girls were once again alone in the house, they heard the now familiar knocking sounds. This time, the knocking seemed to be coming from behind the walls themselves. Summoning courage, they investigated the source of the noise, and what they discovered would scar them forever. Inside a narrow crawl space behind a closet, they found Daniel LaPlante. He was standing in the small, hidden area, wearing the clothes of their deceased mother and wielding a hatchet. His face was painted with a grotesque grin, and his eyes were wide with a deranged excitement. The realization that he had been living inside their home for weeks, spying on them and moving freely through the walls, was almost too much for the sisters to comprehend. The girls screamed and bolted from the house, seeking refuge at a neighbor's place. Brian Andrews immediately contacted the police, who arrived and searched the property. What they found was horrifying. LaPlante had been using a network of crawl spaces, walls, and hidden passageways to navigate the house without being detected. He had drilled holes in walls to watch the sisters in their rooms, and he had even created makeshift hiding spots for himself throughout the home. LaPlante was arrested and charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, among other offenses. However, this would not be the end of his reign of terror. While the Andrews family attempted to recover from the trauma of LaPlante's invasion, LaPlante's violent tendencies only escalated. After being released from a juvenile detention center, he went on to commit a series of heinous crimes that would solidify his place as one of Massachusetts' most notorious criminals. That on December 1st, 1987, LaPlante broke into the home of Priscilla Gustafson, a pregnant nursery school teacher who lived in Townsend. Priscilla's husband came home that evening to a scene of unimaginable horror. Priscilla had been shot and killed in her bedroom, and her two young children, Abigail and William, had been brutally murdered as well. Abigail drowned in the upstairs bathroom, and William strangled in his bed. That LaPlante was quickly linked to the crime, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found at the scene, and he was arrested after a brief manhunt. The case against LaPlante was clear-cut, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Andrews sisters and the Gustafson family were forever changed by LaPlante's actions. The psychological damage inflicted on the Andrews girls was immense, as they struggled to reconcile with the fact that their home had been infiltrated and their privacy violated in the most grotesque way. For the Gustafsons, the loss of a mother and two children was a tragedy that left a permanent scar on the community. Daniel LaPlante's story serves as a chilling reminder of how a seemingly ordinary person can become a source of unimaginable horror. His ability to manipulate, stalk, and invade the lives of his victims highlights the terrifying reality that sometimes the true horror is not a ghost or a spirit, but a living, breathing intruder hiding in the shadows. Even decades later, the name Daniel LaPlante still evokes fear and unease, and his crimes continue to be remembered as some of the most horrifying Home Alone incidents in history. Chapter 2. The Denver Spider in 1941, Denver, Colorado, became the setting for one of the most bizarre and unsettling home invasion cases in American history. It was a crime that left the local community shocked and perplexed, a story that seemed almost too strange to be true. At the heart of this chilling case was Theodore Edward Connies, a man whose ability to live undetected within the walls of another person's home earned him the eerie nickname, the Denver Spider-Man. The crime involved Philip Peters, an elderly man who lived a quiet life with his wife in a modest home. For months, Peters had no idea that an uninvited guest was living in the walls of his own house, moving silently through a series of hidden crawl spaces and attic openings. This guest, Theodore Connies, would ultimately murder Peters when he was discovered, turning an already strange situation into a gruesome nightmare. Theodore Connies was born in 1882 in Illinois. His early life was marked by tragedy and hardship. He was a sickly child, suffering from poor health that limited his ability to engage in typical childhood activities. His frail condition made him a target for ridicule and left him isolated and withdrawn. As a result, he struggled to form relationships and spent much of his early life alone. By adulthood, Connies found himself drifting aimlessly, struggling to hold down jobs due to his health and the harsh realities of life during the Great Depression. He moved from place to place, never finding stability or success. His deteriorating health and lack of resources eventually led him to homelessness. By the time he was in his late 50s, he was living on the streets of Denver, Colorado, with nowhere to turn and no one to help him. Philip Peters, a retired railroad worker, was known around his neighborhood as a kind and gentle man. He lived with his wife, Helen, in their home at 3335 West Moncrief Place. The couple had been married for decades and enjoyed a quiet, uneventful life. In September 1941, Helen was hospitalized due to a broken hip, leaving Philip alone in the house. This period of loneliness and isolation set the stage for his encounter with Theodore Connies. Connies had known Philip Peters from years earlier, when they briefly interacted through a local social club. Desperate and hungry, Connies decided to approach Peters for help. He knocked on the door of the Peters home, hoping for a meal or a place to stay. But Philip Peters, though compassionate, had no intention of letting Connies live in his house. He offered him some food and sent him on his way, unaware of the deadly consequence this rejection would have. Connies, feeling both humiliated and enraged, made a fateful decision. He knew the Peters home well enough to remember a small trapdoor in the closet that led to the attic. With Philip unaware, Connies sneaked back into the house and found his way to this hidden opening. He made himself at home in the tiny crawl space above the house, an area so small that he had to contort his body to fit. Thus began his secret life as a shadowy intruder living within the walls of Philip Peters' home. Connie's lived undetected in the attic for several months, emerging only when Philip was either out or asleep. He would sneak down to the kitchen, steal small amounts of food, and then retreat back to his hiding place. He moved quietly and efficiently, taking care to leave no trace of his presence. He even carved out small peepholes in the walls and ceilings so he could observe Philip's movements throughout the house. The strain of living in such confined quarters, coupled with the constant fear of being discovered, pushed Connie's to the brink of madness. His resentment toward Philip Peters grew with each passing day. He saw the elderly man as the reason for his suffering, the one who had denied him the help he so desperately sought. Philip, on the other hand, remained completely unaware that his every move was being watched by a man he thought was long gone. That on October 17, 1941, everything changed. That evening, Philip Peters returned home after visiting his wife at the hospital. As he entered his kitchen, he was confronted by Connie's, who had decided it was time to show himself. Startled and confused, Philip tried to defend himself, but he was no match for the desperate, emaciated intruder. Connie's grabbed an iron stove shaker, a heavy tool used for stoking coal fires, and struck Philip repeatedly. The elderly man fell to the ground, bleeding profusely from his head. Connie's continued to beat him until he was sure that Philip was dead. After committing the murder, Connie's dragged Philip's lifeless body into a bedroom and covered him with a blanket. Panicking, Connie's fled back to his tiny crawl space, leaving Philip's body to be discovered by neighbors who came to check on him after noticing his absence. The murder of Philip Peters baffled the Denver police. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The house was locked from the inside, and despite a thorough search, the police found no clues that could explain how the killer had entered or escaped. With no suspects, the case went cold. Neighbors reported strange noises coming from the house, but police dismissed them as paranoia. It wasn't until months later, in July 1942, that the mystery of the Denver Spider-Man was finally solved. That a neighbor noticed movement in the supposedly empty house and called the police. When officers arrived, they conducted another search, focusing on the attic. There, they discovered Theodore Connie's, malnourished and disheveled, hiding in the cramped crawl space. The officers were shocked to learn that Connie's had been living there for almost a year, surviving on stolen food and enduring the cold winter months in the tiny space. Connie's was arrested and charged with the murder of Philip Peters. During his confession, he described in detail how he had lived undetected in the house, his growing hatred for Philip, and the events that led up to the murder. The press quickly dubbed him the Denver Spider-Man, and his story became infamous across the country. Connie's was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent the remainder of his days in the Colorado State Penitentiary, where he died in 1967. His case remains one of the most disturbing home invasion stories, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural entities, but real people hiding in the shadows. Chapter 3. The Miyazaki Hider in the House Case.in 2008. A seemingly ordinary home in Fukuoka, Japan, became the scene of an unsettling revelation that would baffle and disturb people around the world. The case involved a man who discovered that a stranger had been secretly living in his house for nearly a year, sneaking around and helping herself to his food while he remained completely unaware. This bizarre and creepy incident would go on to be known as the Miyazaki Hider in the House case, highlighting the terrifying reality of how someone could invade your most private space without detection. The homeowner, a man in his 40s whose identity has been withheld for privacy reasons, lived alone in a modest one-story house in the bustling city of Fukuoka. For months, he had noticed strange occurrences around his home. Food items seemed to vanish more quickly than usual. Household goods were mysteriously moved, and sometimes he could swear he'd left the bathroom light on when it had been switched off. Initially, he dismissed these incidents, attributing them to his own forgetfulness or simple coincidences. However, as time went on, the unexplained happenings became more frequent and unsettling. One day, after returning from work, he found that some of his food was missing yet again. This time, it wasn't just a small quantity. There were several containers and packages that had noticeably been tampered with. His pantry, which he distinctly remembered stocking up a few days earlier, was nearly bare in some sections. Growing increasingly frustrated and suspicious, he began to wonder if he was the victim of a series of petty thefts. To eliminate the possibility that he was being robbed, he decided to install security cameras in his home. It seemed like an extreme measure, but he wanted to be sure. He placed the cameras in key locations around the house, focusing on entry points like the front door and windows, as well as the kitchen where the thefts seemed to occur most frequently. For the first few days, the footage revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No strangers entered the home, and there were no signs of forced entry. But as he reviewed the recordings more carefully, he noticed something truly disturbing. During the early hours of the morning, a shadowy figure appeared in his kitchen, a small woman quietly and methodically opening cabinets, helping herself to his food. The homeowner couldn't believe his eyes. The woman seemed to know exactly where everything was, moving around the kitchen with an unsettling familiarity. After eating and drinking, she closed the cabinets, wiped down any surfaces she touched, and then disappeared back into the darkness, leaving no trace of her presence. What puzzled the man even more was that she didn't leave the house after eating. Instead, she vanished back into the shadows of the kitchen. Determined to uncover the truth, he installed an additional camera in his living room and another one aimed at a corner of the kitchen where the woman had last been seen. The following night, he caught the woman on camera again. This time, he watched in horror as she climbed down from a small storage space above his kitchen. The storage space was part of a traditional Japanese home feature called a tenjura, a small attic-like compartment typically used for storing seasonal items or rarely used belongings. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This woman had been living in his house the entire time. She was hiding in the ceiling above his kitchen and coming down only when she was sure he wasn't around. Terrified and uncertain of what to do, the man immediately called the police. He reported that a stranger had been living in his house and was still inside. A team of officers arrived at the house and cautiously approached the attic space. As they opened the small hatch door, they were met with a shocking sight. A frail, disheveled woman crouched in the cramped, dark space. The woman was identified as a 58-year-old homeless person who had been living in the homeowner's attic for nearly a year. She had managed to remain completely undetected by moving around with extreme caution and precision. During police questioning, she explained how she had entered the house. One day, she had found the front door unlocked while the man was out and decided to take refuge inside. She intended to stay only for a short while, but ended up living there for months. The woman survived by taking small amounts of food at a time, careful not to draw attention to herself. She would sneak down from her hiding place whenever the homeowner was at work or asleep. She used the bathroom and shower when he was not home and made sure to put everything back in its original place. Her goal was to stay hidden for as long as possible, unnoticed and invisible. The living conditions in the attic were appalling. The space was no more than a few feet high, forcing her to crouch or lie down most of the time. It had no ventilation, and the summer heat made it unbearably hot. Despite these harsh conditions, she chose to remain in the attic rather than live on the streets, believing that being discovered was less likely in the confined space of the house than in public areas. The woman was arrested and charged with trespassing and theft, but the homeowner decided not to press further charges, citing sympathy for her dire circumstances. He expressed relief that the ordeal had not turned violent and that he now knew the cause of the strange happenings in his home. After the woman's arrest, local authorities investigated her background. They discovered that she had been homeless for several years, moving from place to place and occasionally breaking into houses to find shelter. This was the longest period she had ever spent in one location. The story gained international attention due to its sheer eeriness and the thought-provoking questions it raised about privacy, security, and the desperation faced by the homeless. Many people found it difficult to comprehend how someone could live undetected in such a small space for so long. The case became a topic of discussion and led to greater awareness about the homeless population and the lengths to which some will go to find refuge. For the homeowner, the experience was both shocking and traumatic. The knowledge that a stranger had been living just a few feet above him for nearly a year made it impossible for him to feel safe in his own home. He moved out shortly after the incident, unable to shake the feeling that his privacy had been irreparably violated. The Miyazaki hider in the house case remains one of the most disturbing examples of home intrusion in modern history. It serves as a reminder that even in the safety of our own homes, we must remain vigilant, as sometimes the most terrifying dangers come from where we least expect them, just above our heads. Chapter 4. The Rock Hill Attic Intruder. In September 2012, the quiet suburban town of Rock Hill, South Carolina, was rocked by a disturbing discovery that seemed to come straight out of a horror movie. A local woman, whose identity has been withheld for privacy reasons, began to suspect that something strange was happening in her home. The case would later become known as the Rock Hill Attic Intruder Incident, and it serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats are not from strangers, but from people we once trusted. The woman, a single mother of 5 children, had been living alone in her modest 2-story home in Rock Hill for several years. Everything seemed normal until one day, she began to hear strange noises coming from the attic above her. The sounds were faint at first, soft thuds and what sounded like shuffling. At first, she dismissed them, assuming it was just a small animal, like a squirrel or raccoon, that had found its way into her attic. Such occurrences were not uncommon in the area, and she believed it was a problem that could be solved easily. But as the days passed, the noises grew louder and more frequent. They were no longer the soft sounds of a small animal moving around, but heavier thuds and the occasional creak of floorboards. At night, she could hear these noises more clearly, and she found it increasingly difficult to sleep. The thought that something or someone might be in her attic began to weigh heavily on her mind. Then, other strange things began to happen. Food that she was certain she had bought would go missing. Household items were not where she had left them, and at times, she would find her kitchen window slightly ajar when she knew she had closed it. A chilling suspicion started to grow in her mind. Was someone living in her home? Too afraid to investigate on her own, the woman confided in her adult nephew about the strange occurrences. Concerned for her safety, he agreed to come over and check the attic for her. Together, they climbed the narrow staircase leading up to the attic door. The woman stood back as her nephew slowly opened the door and shone a flashlight into the dark, musty space. What they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. Huddled in the corner of the attic, partially concealed behind old boxes and insulation, was a man, her ex-boyfriend. He looked disheveled, with dirty clothes and unkempt hair. He had clearly been living there for some time. The woman gasped in shock and disbelief as she recognized the man she thought she had left in her past. He stared back at them with a mixture of anger and desperation. Her nephew yelled at the intruder, demanding to know what he was doing there, but the man offered no coherent explanation. Instead, he tried to defend his actions, claiming he had nowhere else to go. He began pleading with them not to call the police. But there was no way they could let him continue living in the attic, especially after the horrifying details of his presence were uncovered. As they examined the attic, they found a makeshift bed made of old blankets and clothes. There were empty food containers and water bottles strewn about, evidence that he had been taking food from the kitchen. Even more unsettling was the discovery of a small cup, which he had been using as a toilet. The man had created a primitive setup to sustain himself without leaving the attic for long periods of time. But perhaps the most disturbing find was the small holes he had drilled in the attic's floorboards and air vents. These holes were positioned in such a way that he could spy on the woman while she was in her bedroom and living room below. He had been watching her every move, completely unbeknownst to her. It was a gross invasion of privacy and left the woman feeling violated and terrified. Realizing the severity of the situation, the woman's nephew called 911 immediately. The police arrived within minutes, and the ex-boyfriend was arrested without incident. During questioning, the man revealed that he had been released from prison just 2 weeks prior and had nowhere to go. Knowing that the woman lived alone, he decided to sneak into her attic when he saw an opportunity, and he broke into the house one day while she was out, using the attic as a hiding place. He had planned to stay only a few days until he figured out his next move. But as days turned into weeks, he found it increasingly difficult to leave. His presence in the attic became a twisted routine. He would wait for the woman to leave for work or go to bed, then sneak downstairs to eat, shower, and use the bathroom. He even watched her through the holes he had drilled, feeding his obsession and convincing himself that he could remain hidden indefinitely. The police charged the man with several counts, including burglary, trespassing, and harassment. He was taken back to prison, where he faced additional charges for violating his parole. The woman was left to grapple with the psychological aftermath of the invasion. The discovery of her ex-boyfriend living just above her head for weeks left the woman deeply shaken and traumatized. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after the man was arrested. The thought that someone she once knew and trusted could invade her space so completely filled her with fear and paranoia. The house that was once her sanctuary now felt like a place of violation and danger. Unable to continue living there, the woman moved out of the house shortly after the incident. She couldn't bear to stay in a place where she had been unknowingly monitored and stalked. The home was sold, and she relocated to a different town, seeking a fresh start away from the traumatic memories. The story of the Rock Hill attic intruder quickly spread through local news outlets and beyond, serving as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can lurk within our homes. The incident reminded people to be vigilant, trust their instincts, and take action if they suspect something unusual in their surroundings. The Rock Hill attic intruder case is a sobering reminder of how easily our personal spaces can be invaded. It also highlights the importance of securing one's home and paying attention to unusual signs, no matter how trivial they may seem. The woman's experience was a nightmare that she will likely never forget, but her courage in confronting the situation ultimately led to the intruder's capture and the restoration of her safety, albeit at the cost of her sense of security. Years later, the incident still lingers in the memories of those who heard about it, serving as a haunting example of the dangers that can come not from strangers, but from those we once knew and trusted. Chapter 5. The Ohio College Dormitory Intruder. There are some horror stories that play out in real life, ones that make you rethink your sense of safety in the places you consider most secure. The story of the Ohio College Dormitory Intruder is one such case. A terrifying incident that reveals how real the fear of being watched or followed can be. In 2013, an incident occurred at Ohio's prestigious Hocking College that left students and staff in shock. What began as a series of small, inexplicable occurrences in a dormitory bathroom escalated into the chilling discovery that someone had been secretly living inside the building for months. That it all started innocently enough. Female students living in the dormitory reported minor disturbances, missing food, misplaced toiletries, and odd noises coming from the bathroom vents. Most residents brushed it off, attributing it to forgetfulness or dormitory pranks. But as the weeks went on, the frequency of these incidents increased, and a sense of unease began to spread. Students started to feel as if they were being watched, their movements somehow observed even when no one else was around. The situation took a sinister turn when a group of girls noticed that personal items such as underwear and cosmetics were disappearing at an alarming rate. One of the students, feeling particularly unnerved by the repeated losses, reported it to the dormitory's resident advisor, who in turn alerted campus security. Security performed a preliminary search of the dorm, checking for unlocked windows or signs of unauthorized entry. They found nothing unusual, but the eerie atmosphere persisted, and the strange occurrences didn't stop. What no one realized at the time was that the intruder wasn't coming in from the outside. He was already inside, living just above their heads. The turning point came one night in late 2013, when a student returning from a late-night study session at the library noticed something truly disturbing. As she entered the communal bathroom on her dorm floor, she heard a faint shuffling sound coming from the ceiling tiles above the stalls. She brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the creaks and groans of an old building. But as she moved further into the bathroom, she saw a small tile in the ceiling shift slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of a human face staring down at her. Terrified, the student bolted from the bathroom and ran straight to the RA's room. Campus security was called immediately, and they arrived within minutes. What they found when they investigated the bathroom was something straight out of a nightmare. After carefully removing several ceiling tiles, security officers discovered a small makeshift den hidden in the space above the bathroom. It was a claustrophobic, dusty area crammed with stolen items, clothes, food wrappers, personal toiletries, and even a sleeping bag. The intruder, a man in his 20s, had been living in the ceiling of the dormitory bathroom for an undetermined amount of time. He would wait until the students were asleep or away from their rooms to sneak down and steal food, clothing, and other supplies. It was later revealed that he had gained access to the dorm through an unsecured maintenance entrance and had somehow managed to avoid detection for months. When confronted by security, the man attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended. His appearance was disheveled, his clothes stained and dirty from living in such cramped quarters. During the subsequent investigation, it was discovered that he wasn't a current student but had been a former attendee at the college. After dropping out, he had apparently decided to return to the campus and found his way into the dorms, where he managed to hide in plain sight. The story doesn't end there. After his arrest, it was reported by several major news outlets, including HuffPost and the local Ohio media, that the man had a history of petty theft and trespassing. However, his motive for hiding in the ceiling remained unclear. Some speculated that he might have been mentally unstable, while others feared he had more sinister intentions. According to police reports, the intruder showed little remorse for his actions and seemed more concerned about being caught than about the fear he had instilled in the students. The psychological impact on the students was profound. Some moved out of the dormitory entirely, unable to shake the feeling of being violated in what should have been their safest space. One student interviewed by a local news station described how she felt a constant sense of paranoia, checking every nook and cranny of her room for hidden dangers. She spoke of sleepless nights and the persistent fear that someone might still be watching. Hocking College took immediate action to reassure students and parents that the campus was secure. Additional security measures were implemented, including installing surveillance cameras and securing all maintenance and access points. The dormitory in question was thoroughly inspected, and access to non-students was strictly monitored moving forward. Despite these efforts, the incident left a lasting scar on the college community, serving as a grim reminder of how easily safety can be compromised. In the aftermath, there were many questions about how such a situation could go unnoticed for so long. How did no one notice the missing food or personal items accumulating in the ceiling space? Why didn't anyone connect the dots earlier? The incident sparked debates about dormitory security and the responsibilities of campus authorities to ensure student safety. Some critics argued that the college's initial response to the missing items and unusual sounds had been too dismissive. If security had taken the initial reports more seriously, perhaps the intruder would have been discovered sooner. Others pointed out the inherent challenges of maintaining security in shared living spaces like college dorms, where dozens of students come and go at all hours. Ultimately, the Ohio College dormitory intruder case remains a chilling example of how the line between safety and danger can blur in unexpected ways. The thought that someone could be lurking in the very building you call home, observing your every move, is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Even though the intruder was eventually caught, the psychological damage he inflicted lingers on. This story also underscores a terrifying truth. Sometimes, the threat isn't an outsider breaking in, it's already inside, hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting. For the students at Hocking College, that fear became all too real. Chapter 6. The North Carolina Attic Man Incident in 2019. A woman in Rock Hill, North Carolina, experienced a terrifying ordeal when she discovered her ex-boyfriend living secretly in her attic. The woman, who asked not to be identified for safety reasons, began noticing strange noises coming from above her ceiling. Initially, she dismissed the sounds, thinking they might be due to an animal or a structural issue with the house. However, the noises persisted, and she eventually decided to investigate further. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a series of unusual thumps above her. Startled, she noticed something even more alarming. Several nails began popping out from the ceiling over her bed, falling to the floor one by one. The sight made her heart race, and she realized that something or someone was moving directly above her. Afraid to confront the situation alone, she called her older son and nephew, who lived nearby, to help check the attic. Together, they cautiously opened the attic door and shone a flashlight into the darkness. To their shock, they found a man curled up and hiding behind some insulation. He had made a makeshift bed using old coats and jackets that had been stored in the attic and had been living in a small heating unit in the attic space. The intruder turned out to be her ex-boyfriend, who had been released from prison just 2 weeks earlier. The woman had broken off the relationship with him several years prior and had since tried to keep her distance. However, the man had re-entered her life when she hired him for some home repairs about a year earlier, not knowing that he would use this opportunity to secretly gain access to her home. After being released from jail, he decided to hide in her attic instead of reaching out or seeking accommodation elsewhere. The man had entered the house while she was away, climbing up into the attic and setting up a living space using items already stored there. He survived by sneaking down from the attic when she was at work or asleep, taking food from the kitchen, and using the bathroom before returning to his hiding place. When confronted by the woman's son and nephew, the man fled the scene before the police could arrive. Law enforcement officers began a search for him and are still trying to determine exactly how he gained entry to the attic without the woman's knowledge. The woman, a mother of 5, expressed deep concern and fear for her family's safety following the discovery. She reported that her children were traumatized by the incident and were now afraid to sleep in their own rooms. The ex-boyfriend's history of criminal behavior didn't end there. Police discovered that he had previously been arrested for stealing the woman's truck earlier that year and had been serving a sentence for that crime. He had just finished serving his sentence when he sneaked into her home and hid in the attic. The terrifying ordeal left the woman feeling violated and unsafe in her own home. She moved out of the house shortly after the incident, fearing that her ex-boyfriend might return or that there could be other hidden dangers she was not yet aware of. She described the experience as a real-life nightmare, saying that the thought of someone watching her and her children from above was deeply disturbing. The case serves as a grim reminder of how vulnerable people can be in their own homes and highlights the importance of taking strange noises and signs seriously. The incident was reported by various news outlets, including SOC TV and the Christian Post, and remains a stark example of the lengths to which some people will go to invade others' personal space. Chapter 7. The Honolulu Frogger Incident. In September 19, James and Brittany Campbell, a newlywed couple living in Honolulu, Hawaii, returned home from a week-long vacation to find their house completely disarrayed and occupied by an unwelcome guest. They initially thought it was a break-in, but they soon discovered something far more chilling. The intruder, identified as Ezekiel Zayas, had not only been living in their home, but had also spent his time inside crafting disturbing plans that suggested he intended to do much more than just hide. The phenomenon, known as frogging, involves individuals secretly living in someone else's home without their knowledge, often for days, weeks, or even longer. When the Campbells returned home, they noticed that their belongings had been moved around, strange items were scattered throughout the house, and some of their food had gone missing. James initially thought a homeless person might have broken in and left, but when he saw his bike sitting outside, something he distinctly remembered placing inside before they left, he began to suspect that the intruder was still inside. As James entered the house, he found Zayas wearing his clothes and calmly claiming, "This is not your house," as he tried to hold the door shut. Stunned and terrified, James managed to force his way in and call the police. When officers arrived, they arrested Zayas on burglary charges. However, this was just the beginning of a deeply unsettling discovery. Upon searching the house further, the police and the Campbells found disturbing notes and items that Zayas had left behind. He had been using their computers to write bizarre entries that included plans for performing surgeries on the couple and their 2 young sons. Zayas had detailed anatomical sketches and references to conducting medical procedures on them, along with the unsettling notion of converting the family into something he called Ezekiel's. This evidence suggested that Zayas had been watching the family for far longer than the 1 week they had been gone. Investigators also discovered that Zayas had been recording video diaries of himself inside the house, often while completely naked and lounging in Brittany's chair. He had meticulously arranged certain rooms and left what appeared to be offerings or strange concoctions in their kitchen. Zayas's behavior went beyond mere trespassing. It seemed he was methodically planning something far more dangerous for the family. Ezekiel Zayas was charged with first-degree burglary and initially placed on supervised release while awaiting trial. However, his behavior continued to escalate. Shortly after being released, he was rearrested for vandalizing a Buddhist temple in Manoa, Hawaii. In 2020, while being held at the Oahu Community Correctional Center, Zayas brutally attacked and killed his 62-year-old cellmate, Vance Grace. He was charged with manslaughter, second-degree assault, and first-degree murder, for which he later pleaded guilty. In August 2023, Zayas was sentenced to 40 years in prison for his crimes. The judge handed down the maximum sentence for each conviction, ensuring that Zayas would remain incarcerated for decades. He was found to be unfit to stand trial for the murder charges at first, but was eventually tried and convicted for the brutal assault and subsequent death of his cellmate. The case drew national attention and was featured on the show Frogging, Hider in My House, which explores real-life cases of people secretly living in others' homes. The Campbells have since moved out of Hawaii altogether, struggling to rebuild their sense of security and privacy after such a traumatic experience. The Honolulu Frogger incident serves as a chilling reminder of how easily one's sense of safety can be shattered. What started as a suspicion of a break-in turned into a horrifying revelation of an intruder who had been living in their home, spying on them, and planning unspeakable things. The psychological impact on the Campbell family was profound, leaving them fearful and disturbed even after Zayas was arrested and taken.